Perfect. Okay, now let's get started. So as we discussed in the last class, we'll continue with the question that we were doing. That was May, June 2014 exam. And then we'll move on and discuss other questions after that. Okay, just a second. Right. Okay, so we were doing these questions. This question number 2 of May, June 14. Just give me a second. This is 15 and this is 16. October, November. Oh, I think I mistakenly opened October, November. That was not the one. Just give me a second. This is November and this is 14. Yes, this is the one. So question paper 4.2. Do you have any specific question that you want to ask me? Any topic that... Okay. So right, this is the one. Okay, so we were doing question number 2 and we could not complete it in the last class. So we'll start off with this first and then we'll continue. Okay, now the question here said the analysis of marginal utility as an explanation of consumer behavior can only be related to the purchase of one good, okay, cannot be used if incomes increase, and is not applicable if advertising causes a change in tastes. It is in practice not a useful guide to consumer. Okay, perfect. Now, reading through the question, right, sure, we can do that. We can do that. Perfect, right? So think about this. Now, first of all, what you have to do in this question is, first of all, you have to explain what consumer equilibrium is and what consumer equilibrium actually shows, right? So have a look at this. So you will say consumer equilibrium is a model that explains consumers' spending patterns. It shows how consumers will allocate their income between different goods based on the marginal utility that consumer receive from those products and the prices that they have to pay for the goods, right? Now, in that, as we were talking about yesterday, so on the graph, you show it through budget line and indifference curve. So let's just say consumer is interested in buying 2 products, Coke and apples, right? So any 2 products you can assume, right? And there are a few assumptions that we make in this model. First is that consumer will spend all of his or her income, so there will be no savings. Secondly, there are only 2 products that the consumer can consume, let's say Coke and apples. You can take any 2 products. Another thing is that preferences are fixed. So preferences do not change during that time period. And incomes are fixed during a certain time periods, income do not change and so on. Okay, now we know how to make the budget line. So budget line shows what is the maximum amount, what is the maximum quantity of the 2 goods that the consumer can consume with available amount of income, right? So let's say the maximum quantity of Coke that the consumer can consume is 100 units, and the maximum quantity of apples that the consumer can afford is, let's say, 36, right? Okay, now this is the budget line. So any point within the budget line is affordable, right? Any point on the line shows that it is again affordable, and on the line shows that you are fully utilizing your income without any saving, right? Any point within the curve shows that obviously this point is affordable, but over here you are saving some of your income. So we will assume, as we just said, that consumer always operates on the budget line. Why? Because the consumer wants to maximize his or her utility, which means that the consumer doesn't want to save anything. He or she wants to spend all of his income so that he or she can buy as many goods and services as much he can, right? So that is what you need to remember. Okay, now moving forward, students, have a look at this. So this is your budget line, and then there will be an indifference curve which shows your preferences, consumers' preferences basically, right? And it's a downward sloping curve bending towards the origin. And just a second, and there will be one point that will be tangent to your indifference curve, right? So there will be one point on the budget line that will be tangent to your indifference curve. So that is your equilibrium point. That point shows how much quantity, that shows how much quantity of the 2 goods the consumer will consume and which maximizes his utility. So let's say the consumer will want to consume 25 units of Coke and let's say 12 units of apples to maximize his or her utility, right? Now, this being said, at this equilibrium point, equimarginal principle holds true. What is equimarginal principle? Equimarginal principle is mathematical representation of the equilibrium point. Equimarginal principle, we call it. And the way we write this down, equimarginal principle is equals to, have a look at this, marginal utility of A divided by price of A right? Or let's use the same products that we're using. So marginal utility of Coke divided by price of Coke is equals to marginal utility of apples divided by price of apples, right? Okay, now we did talk about this yesterday, that if you are getting higher marginal utility for each dollar that you're spending on the good, right? So that is the product that you will prefer over the other good. Why? Because obviously that product is giving you more satisfaction for each unit of currency that you spend on that. And obviously incomes are limited, so consumers want to spend their incomes in the best possible manner. Any confusion about this? We good? Okay, now moving forward from here. Okay, then for this question, now the question was saying that this formula doesn't apply, this concept of consumer equilibrium does not cannot explain what happens in the case of two products. It only explains for one product. First thing that it said. Have a look at this. Can only be related to the purchase of one good. So first of all, we will say that this is absolutely incorrect. Why? Because we have just seen that on the graph, we had two products, right? So we had two products that the consumer could have chosen between, right? Okay. And then even if you have multiple products, by the way, have a look at this quickly. I don't know if you got the chance to look at this. So we can extend the concept of equity marginal principle to unlimited number of goods. How do we do that? Have a look at this. So marginal utility of A divided by price of A is equals to marginal utility of B divided by price of B. Similarly, marginal utility of C divided by price of C, and so on and so forth. It does not end. Are you getting me? So in real life, if you assume, right, N means like unlimited amounts of products. So if you think of a real life situation where we as consumers have unlimited products to consume, then technically equity marginal principle will still be valid. Why? Because we will be again doing the same basic principle. What is the same basic principle? That we compare how much utility we get from any particular good and how much price we have to pay for that good. So out of all the products, let's say on one typical day, let's say, or during 1 month or whatever the time duration is, we are not interested in that. So if there are 100 products that a consumer can consume in a certain time period, and he or she wants to compare that which product should be given the highest priority, then the principle stays the same. Whichever products gives you highest level of utility for each rupee or each dollar that you spend on it, that is the product that you would want to buy in priority over other goods. That's the thing what you need to remember. Is this making sense? Is it making sense? Is this simple? Right. Okay. Now, this being said, so first thing we rejected that it doesn't. It said that it can only be applied to the purchase of one good, which is incorrect. It can be applied to two products. Cannot be used if incomes increase. That's again incorrect. Why is that incorrect? You will explain that if incomes change, what happens? Yeah. Do you remember that if incomes are changing, so if incomes decrease, there will be a parallel shift in the budget line. There will be a parallel inward shift in the budget line, which shows that now consumers can afford less. Obviously, when there are lower incomes and the prices of the products are fixed, so now you can afford lesser quantities of both the goods. Just a second. So it will shift inwards. So instead of, let's say, 36 units of apples, now you can only afford 24. And instead of 100 units of Coke, you can only afford 50, right? So a parallel shift in the budget line inwards. And similarly, obviously, if incomes are increasing, there will be a parallel shift outward in the budget line, which shows that now you have more affordability if incomes increase, right? Okay, so again, what the question was saying was incorrect, that it doesn't account for the change in incomes. And the last thing that it said, now this is very important. Have a look at this. The last thing that it said, that and consumer equilibrium is not applicable if advertising causes a change in taste. Again, that's incorrect. How so? Let me tell you. Think about this. Now, think about what effect advertisement have on us as a normal consumer. What effect advertisement have on us? So advertisement of a product makes us more inclined or more likely to buy that good. If we, let's say, we want to buy anything and I come across an advertisement for Coke or Pepsi, so otherwise I might be interested in buying something else. But when I go to shop, since I've seen an ad which I really like, I might be interested in buying that product, right? Now, that being said, right, exactly, demand should increase. Very good. And how is that represented? Now, this is important in this model. Isha, how would that be represented? So that would mean that I would assign, because think about this, marginal utility is a number made up by the mind. Are you getting what I'm trying to say? A number made up by the mind. So if you think about this, what tells you what happens? What's the process that tells you that you like one thing more than other? Are you getting me or not, right? So you have, let's say, consumed Coke a couple of times and you have consumed Pepsi a couple of times. And similarly, you might have used different phones and you might have used different brands of, I don't know, clothes and so on and so forth. But it is our mind by the mind, sorry. It is our mind that tells us which product we like more and which product we like less, right? So when we see an advertisement, we assume, right, that this product would give us more utility because that is a better fit to our needs. Are you getting how I'm trying to, explain this? That our minds tell us that this is a better fit when we see the advertisement and all that makes us, obviously, if that was an influential advertisement. Sometimes not every advertisement have an influence on us. We see so many couple of ads on YouTube, billboards everywhere, right? Nowadays, everything is commercial, but not every advertisement has the same effect. But advertisements that we see influencing and, which have an effect on us, then for those products, we are more likely to consume those. Advertisement makes us more likely to buy a good, right? And when that happens, think about this, to buy a good. And when that happens, what would we do? So let's get back to a basic equimarginal principle and see how would that be reflected over here. Let's say, so I was consuming Coke and I was consuming apples, right? So these are the two products that we were comparing initially. Okay. Now, I saw an advertisement on the newspaper or like television, wherever, right, about Coke. So let's say previously I was in equilibrium. Have a look at this. So previously I was in equilibrium where, right, each apple was giving me 50 utils of utility, and I had to spend, let's say, 5 rupees per apple, right? Are you getting me? On the other hand, each bottle of Coke, let's say, was giving me 10 utils of utility, and I was spending 10 rupees on each glass or whatever it is, right? Okay. Now, this being said, the person, I was in equilibrium position. Why? Because 100 divided by 10 is 10, right? And 50 divided by 5 is also 10, right? Are you getting me? So I was in equilibrium situation. Are you getting me? So the margin utility from each dollar spent on a good was the same for Coke as much it was for the apples. So the margin utility from Coke against every dollar spent on Coke was the same as the margin utility from apples against each dollar spent on Apple. That is how it was, right? Okay, but now what happens? I've seen an advertisement for Coke on television, and now I'm assigning, have a look at this. You can also use these numbers in an exam, like on your exam for a question like this, and that will help you better explain your concept. Okay, now think about this. Now, everything else, this is same because the margin utility from apples has stayed the same, the price of apples has stayed the same, and the price of Coke has also stayed the same. The only thing that has changed is the margin utility that my mind or I am assigning to Coke because I saw an influencing advertisement. Now, this being said, how much is this? So now I'm getting 12 utils of utility for each rupee that I spend on Coke, whereas only 10 util of utility for each rupee that I spend on apples. So what would I buy more? Now, what would I buy more? I would start buying Coke more. Are you getting me? This is what explains, like, this is how the model explains that equimarginal principle would be used to, would be used to explain how consumers would be spending more on one product if they have seen a successful advertisement for that good. And when they do that, they buy more of that good. And when they buy more of that good, have a look at this. Now, if I have to show you on the indifference curve, have a look at this. So let's get rid of all the unnecessary things first. Okay, now this was your equimarginal, like this was your equilibrium situation initially, right? Over here. Okay, over here. Now, when your marginal utility for Coke increased, right? How would that be shown? Have a look at this. The shape of your indifference curve, would change. Now you're more inclined towards buying Coke rather than Pepsi. Nisha, are you getting me? So now you can see for yourself that you are consuming, let's say, more units of Coke and less units of apples compared to your E1, which was your original equilibrium situation, right? So this was your E1. This was your E1 where you were, just a second. This was your E1 where you were consuming much more units of apples and low units of Coke, but now that has changed to E2 where you have started consuming more quantities of Coke and less quantities of apples, right? Are you getting me? Is this simple? So your shape of the indifference curve would change because you have seen a successful advertisement for one of the two products. And now you're more inclined to buy that product rather than the other one, right? Is this simple? So that is what you need to remember. Easy. Can you move on? Okay, now coming to your question. So you wanted me to explain how we show income and substitution effect on the consumer equilibrium graph, right? Let me draw a straight line. Okay, now have a look at this. So we know that whenever the price of a good changes, there it will cause two effects. It will cause two effects when the price of a good changes. It will cause substitution effect and it will cause income effect. Now, to very quickly tell you, first substitution effect. So what does substitution effect say? Substitution effect says that if something is getting cheaper, you should buy more of that, right? When something is becoming cheaper, you should buy more of that. So price change of any product has two effects, right? One, substitution, the other, income effect, right? I will look at this. So income effect and substitution effect. Income effect will come to in a bit, but first let's understand the substitution effect because that's much easier and simpler to explain. Substitution effect says that if something is becoming cheaper, the price of that product is reducing, like due to discount or anything of the sort, you buy more of that thing, right? As simple as that, because obviously that's cheaper. And if that thing becomes expensive for some reason, if any product becomes expensive for some reason, you buy less of that. So this is what substitution effect says. Income effect has two further distinctions. Now, income effect would be different whether we talk about the normal goods or we talk about inferior goods. For normal goods, the idea is pretty simple as we see, right? It says that if overall your real incomes are increasing, you will buy more of that good. Are you getting me, right? So if overall if consumers' real incomes are increasing, you will buy more of that product, and that is income effect. Is it making sense? That is normal good. Income effect would say that you buy more of a product when your real incomes increase. For inferior good, it's the opposite. It says when your real incomes increase, you buy less of that thing. Why? Because as the word suggests, it becomes inferior good. So if my real incomes are increasing, which means my purchasing power is increasing, then why would I want to buy a cheaper brand? Right? So if my real incomes and my purchasing power is increasing, so instead of buying Huawei, I might want to buy, I don't know, Samsung or something else, right? Very good. Okay, great. Now let's come back to the graph and let's see how is that shown, right? So let's assume this is your original budget line where you can buy this many units of whatever, right? Coke and this many units of apples, right? Okay, now let's say apples price is reducing. Now you have to follow it very carefully, right? So apple price reduces and therefore your budget line will shift outwards from the x-axis. So if the price of the product is decreasing, so your budget line will shift outwards from that axis only. If this would have been for, let's say Coke, if Coke would have been becoming cheaper, so your budget line would have shifted somewhat like this. Let me show you, right? So your budget line would have shifted outwards from only the y-axis because you can buy the same quantities of apples, but you can buy more quantities of Coke, right? So this is what you need to remember. But whenever you're making this graph, a tip that, one thing that can always help you, that it's better to assume that the good on the x-axis price is changing because that would be easier to show on the graph. Are you getting me? It's always easier to show. Even if you see all the graphs in different textbooks, they always assume that the price of the product on the x-axis is changing, right? That can increase or that can decrease. Okay, now let's assume that the price is reducing. Price is decreasing. That's why you can afford more apples with the same income. Okay, now have a look at this. So let's assume initially you were operating at this point. Initially you were, and we don't need to see show what is happening on the y-axis good, so you only need to show for the x-axis. Isha, are you getting me? So when you're showing the income and the substitution effect, that would only be for the good on the x-axis, not for the good on the y-axis, right? So let's assume we were initially assuming 50 units of apples, right? Before the change in the price of apples. Now apples became cheaper as we have shown over here. That's why your budget line shifted outwards from the x-axis. Now the new equilibrium would be where the new budget line is intersecting with your indifference curve, right? So this becomes your new quantity that you're consuming, new quantity of apples that you're consuming. So let's assume this is 85, right? 85 units of apples. Okay. Now comes in the main part. You have to pay close attention. Now we have to divide this total change that happened in the consumption of apples in two parts: substitution effect and income effect, right? Is this making sense? So do stop me on any point if that is confusing, right? Now we are about to break this overall change in the consumption of apples in two parts, which are income effect and substitution effect. Okay, now have a look at this, students. Okay, now first thing that you have to draw, you will draw a parallel line. You will draw a parallel line for the new budget line in such a way that it is tangent to your original indifference curve, right? So this is a step that you can even write in your answer, making a parallel line for new budget line, making a parallel line for new budget line in such a way that it is tangent to your original indifference curve, to your original indifference curve, right? I will not write the full form indifference curve, right? Okay. Now, what is your original indifference curve? The orange one. And what is your new budget line? This green one. So I'm making with this blue, I'm making this parallel budget line in such a way that it would be tangent to your, something on this, just a second. It would be tangent to your original indifference curve, right? Just a second. Okay, like this, right? I mean, not a very neat one, I would admit, but if you take a ruler along, if you're interested in this topic, I would highly recommend you that on your actual exam, you take a ruler along. In fact, I can try something else that always helps, right? I mean, much better than what I was trying to do. Okay, is this making sense? Okay, now have a look at this. Now, if you see that the green and the blue lines are parallel. What does parallel mean? That the distance is the same. Now, have a look at this. Now, this is intersecting with your original budget line somewhere over here, right? Are you getting me? So that shows you that this is the change. So your consumption of apples increased from 50 to 60. Now, listen to this very carefully. Since this movement is along the same indifference curve, have a look at this. Since this movement is along the same indifference curve, what do we call it? We call it substitution effect. Movement along same, let me write down on the other, right? Movement along the same indifference curve is, right, what we have just shown on the graph is known as substitution effect. Movement along the same indifference curve is substitution effect. Now we can say that because apples are becoming cheaper, that's why their consumption increased from 50 to 50 to 60 units, right? Because apples are cheaper. So we did explain what is substitution effect. Substitution effect says that if something is becoming cheaper, you buy more of that. Now, since apples are becoming cheaper, so that's why you bought more quantities of apples, and your consumption of apples increased from 50 to 60 units. Is this making sense? Um, right. Sure. Sure, sure, sure. Do let me know when you're ready. Do let me know when you're ready. Okay, great. Right? So think about this. So movement along the same indifference curve we just explained is substitution effect, right? As simple as that. Now, moving forward, the movement between, have a look at this, the movement between two, the movement between the same indifference curve is substitution effect, and movement between two parallel budget lines. These were the two parallel budget lines. So the increase in the consumption of apples from 60 to 85, right, was because of income effect. So this one is income effect and this one is SE, substitution effect. Is it making sense, right? So this one is substitution effect, which is along the same indifference curve as you can see over here. And the difference between the two parallel lines is income effect, right? Is this making sense? So this is what you need to know, right? Any confusion, anything that's not clear, right? Okay, now this was for normal good or inferior good. Isha, can you tell me whether this graph is showing you the normal good or the inferior good? And how can we say that? This is normal good. Excellent. Why? Because what happens now, this can be a little tricky, and that's why I want you to pay more attention to this, right? Think about this. When prices decrease, when any good is becoming cheaper compared to what it was before, when price of a good decreases, your real income increases, right? So when something is becoming cheaper, this means that with the same income, you can buy more, right? This means with the same income, you can buy more. So real income is increasing. And when real income is increasing, as I said, for the normal good, what is the idea? That if your real incomes are increasing, so you should buy more of that good. And you can see in the graph that you are buying more of that good. Both positive. Exactly, absolutely. Now let's move on and quickly show what would happen in the case of inferior good, right? Just a second. What would happen in the case of inferior good? Okay. Now think about this. Right? Okay. Now we have Tangent, yes, that is part of the procedure. Yes, absolutely. That's a very good question. Yes, we will always draw a parallel line with the new budget line in such a way that it is tangent to the original indifference curve. Right, even in the case of inferior goods, absolutely, absolutely, that's correct, right? So again, we are assuming that we are consuming the same two goods, which are Coke and apples. Okay, now think about this. Now, this being said, let's make the original budget. Let's make the original budget line, right? So let's say this is where it is, right? This is your original budget line, right? Then your budget line shifts outward because that product price decreased. The good on the x-axis became cheaper. Are you getting, right? So let's do another thing. Let's do another thing. Just a second, I'm just trying to figure out how would that work. Okay, so this being said, okay, is this simple, right? So in both cases, I'm also trying to explain you how you have to draw it always. Always assume that the good on the x-axis, because this is the easiest way to show it, right? Obviously, you can draw it in other ways as well, but the easiest way to show is that whether you are showing for the inferior good or you're showing it for the normal good, always assume that the good on the x-axis is becoming cheaper. The good on the x-axis is becoming cheaper, right? Okay, now have a look at this. Now, this being said, let's assume your original indifference curve was like this. Your original indifference curve was like this, right? Is it making sense, right? Let's draw it like this. Your original indifference curve looked like, just a second, like this, right? Okay, so you were consuming this much quantity of apples, right? Let's say 50 units of apples. Okay, now X, the good on the x-axis, apples in this case, obviously became cheaper. That's why your budget line shifted outwards from the x-axis. As simple as that. Okay, now the new budget, oh, sorry, indifference curve, let's assume the new budget indifference curve is over here, right? Now this is how much is the new quantities of apples that you're consuming. This is the new quantity of apples that you're consuming, let's say 60 units, right? Now, what is the process? As I just explained, you will draw a budget line parallel to the new budget line. You will draw a budget line parallel to the new budget line in such a way that it is tangent to your previous indifference curve. Are you getting me? Have a look at this. So what I'm doing over here is, right? Just a second. So what I did here is, have a look at this. I'm drawing a budget line that is parallel to the new budget line and is tangent to your previous indifference curve. Does it make sense? Isha, right? Now let me get rid of some extra things. Okay, now have a look at this. This being said, if you see this new line that we've drawn is cutting your indifference curve, your original indifference curve at this point. I mean, this is a close call. I'm sorry, I was expecting it to be a little better, right? So think about this. The movement along the same indifference curve, what is that called? The movement along the same indifference curve. Isha? So this was your substitution effect. So this entire thing from, this was 60 and right, this was your substitution effect from 50 to, sorry, this is not 60, just give me a minute. So this was, green one was 50, the blue one was 60, and let's say the purple one is 70, right? Is it making sense? So 50 to 70, because 50 to 70 is your movement along the same indifference curve, that is your substitution effect. So SE means it is your substitution effect. It is your substitution effect. Easy? Any confusion about this, right? Okay. Now, think about this. The movement along the two parallel budget lines, which is the orange line and the blue line. So if you see the purple and the blue line, there is this much change, and this is going to the left. This much change, and this is going to the left. So that is negative income effect. That is negative income effect. Is this making sense? So this is inferior good. Even though your incomes, real incomes are increasing, even though the real income of consumer is increasing. How do we know that? Because the price of apples is decreasing, which means that now consumers have more purchasing power and they could have purchased more of the good, but still your income effect is moving to the left from 70 to 60, which shows that it is an inferior good. Which shows that it is an inferior good. Now, if we have to show it the same thing for Giffen goods, do you know the difference between inferior and Giffen goods? Right? Do you know the difference between inferior and Giffen goods? Right? Giffen goods are a special kind of inferior goods, right? Giffen goods are a special kind of inferior goods, right? Just give me a second. I'll redo this thing, right? Okay, now Giffen goods are special kind of inferior goods where the income effect is larger than the substitution effect. Now, let me write this down. Giffen goods are special kind of inferior goods where income effect is greater than substitution effect. Goods are special type of inferior goods where income effect is greater than substitution effect. Is it making sense? Right? Okay, now how would you show the Giffen good? If you're interested in showing the Giffen good as well, let's do it right now. Okay, so just right now, we made the graph for the inferior goods. But for Giffen goods, we are saying that Giffen goods are a special kind of inferior good where the income effect is greater than the substitution effect. Now have a look at this. First thing that you have to draw, obviously, is to show the original indifference curve. So have a look at this. So let's assume your original indifference curve was going like this. Just a second. It's always a problem. Do we have a curve here? We don't really. Okay. Okay. This is where your original indifference curve was. Okay. Just a second. Okay, this is a little better, right? So how much quantity of apples were you consuming? You were consuming, let's say, let's keep it simple, 5 units of apples. Is this simple? Okay. Then the new indifference curve was, let's say, over here. The new indifference curve was, let's say, over here. Is it making sense? Right? So you are consuming. So the trick for the Giffen good is that you have to draw it in such a way that it is to the left of your original position. You have to draw it in such a way that it is to the left of your original position. So now you're consuming only 4 units, or let's say 3 units of apples, right? 3 dozens can be 3 dozens or whatever you want to assume it, right? Is it making sense? Okay. Then why is income effect greater? Why is income effect? That's the thing. I'll tell you. So Giffen goods are just a special kind. So if I have to tell you in simple words, Giffen goods assume that they are the extreme case of inferior goods. Giffen goods are an extreme case of inferior goods that as soon as your incomes, real income slightly increase, you want to give up on their consumption altogether. You want to give up on their consumption altogether, right? So let me give you an example. Think about this. So if you think about normal, proper restaurant, right? Let's say a proper restaurant where we go and eat and so on. And then you think of fast food like pizza and so on and so forth. And then you think of a dhaba, right? So out of these 3 categories, obviously restaurant would be a normal good. So when your incomes increase, you will want to go more often outside to eat and so on and so forth, right? Then for the fast food is an inferior good. You can, to some extent, for some people, right? When incomes increase, those people would want to buy less fast food and they would want to go to a proper restaurant. This is how it happens, right? And dhaba would be a given good. It is such a dhaba is basically, street food, which we call in simple words, right? So street food would be totally given good. Why? Because even if your income slightly increase, you would want to not consume that. You would want to not consume that, which I will show you. Street food, right? So think about this. So when your street food is becoming cheaper, right? So ideally you would think that you want to buy more street food, right? But since since you have increase in real incomes, but since you have increase in real income, have a look at this, right? So this was a proper restaurant, right? On the x-axis, you have street food, right? So when your incomes, real incomes increase because street food is becoming cheaper, right? So previously you used to consume, let's say 5 times in a week. So we are thinking of in a week. So 5 times in a week, right? Now at the new equilibrium point, you're only consuming 3 times in a week, which is very surprising. Even though street food is becoming cheaper, why are you not consuming it? But we know the rationale, because people can fall sick. Hygiene is not always, what is that called? Hygiene is not very, it's not very hygienic and so on and so forth. Isha, is it making sense? Do let me know if this is clear. If not, then I can explain you again. So this is what a given good is, right? I'm about to show that. I'm about to show you that. Okay, think about this. Now, again, so you have shown the previous equilibrium, which is this point, right? You have shown the new equilibrium. You have shown the new equilibrium, which is this point, right? A, B. Now, the step or the process of showing the income and the substitution effect stays the same. And what is that step? You make a parallel line. You make a parallel line to the new budget line. You make a parallel line to the new budget line in such a way that it is tangent to your original indifference curve. You make a parallel line to the new budget line in such a way that it is tangent to your original indifference curve. Now have a look at this. Now that is what I'm trying to do over here. Think about this. This is almost parallel, right? Even if not, now it should be parallel, right? Can you see the distance between the Ferozi and the difference between the Ferozi and the purple line is staying the same. The distance is staying the same. Okay. Now this being said, right? Right? Now this being said, it is cutting with your indifference curve at this point. It is cutting with your indifference curve at this point, right? So think about this. So the idea is, now you tell me, now let me label this as C. Now, Isha, you tell me that between what points is your substitution effects, right? And between what points is your income effect? Between what points is your substitution effect and between what points is your income effect? Yeah. So I said the movement along the same indifference curve. The movement along the same indifference curve is your substitution effect. So have a look at this. Now A and C are on the same indifference curve. So when street food became cheaper, now you would listen to this and you will understand this. When street food became cheaper, right? So previously you used to consume 5 times in a week. Now you're consuming 6 times in a week. Okay, yeah, makes sense because street food is becoming cheaper. But then with street food becoming cheaper, your real incomes increased, right? Every time you consume street food, it's not costing you as much as it used to. So then your income effect is, so this was your substitution effect, this was your SE. So substitution effect is always the same, whether it's a normal good or it's an inferior good. If something becomes cheaper, you buy more of that. As simple as that logic, right? But income effect is different between normal goods and inferior goods. Now, since this is a given good, right, you can see that income effect is greater than the substitution effect, and overall your consumption has decreased from 6 times consumption of street food per week to only 3 times consumption per week, because now you have more income, you can afford to go to a restaurant. That's the thing, right? That's the thing. Whereas in the case of this was normal good, right? Whereas in the case of inferior good, you saw that substitution income effect was not greater than substitution effect. In the case of inferior good, substitution effect is not greater than substitution effect. But in the case of given goods, income effect is greater than substitution effect. Right, great, perfect, perfect, perfect. Okay, so Isha, we'll stop here for today. I'll see you tomorrow if we can have a class, because I know your exam is on 26th. Yes or no? So that is coming Tuesday, right? So we'll see if we can have a class. In fact, I'll try my level best to have a class tomorrow, and then we will have a final class on Monday. If you have any other questions, right? Perfect, perfect. Do let me know, share it in the group, bring it to the class, and then we'll discuss it, right? Okay, great. It was nice class. See you then. Take care. Allah Hafiz. Great, perfect. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.